They say a heart can break and still keep beating, but no one tells you how heavy hope feels when it finally works. I read that tonight, written by a young doctor who calls himself Jhon, a boy, really, still too new to the world to understand how it can love you and wound you in the same breath. He wrote that line after saving a newborn with a heart that wasn't built for this world. And I sat here in my old wooden chair, my tea gone cold, rereading his words until they blurred with my own tears. Because I know that kind of exhaustion, the kind that doesn't live in your bones, but in your soul. When every prayer feels like a gamble and every small victory feels too fragile to touch. Jhon said it was his first real patient, a baby so small the tubes looked thicker than his arms. He said for weeks he'd watched that little chest rise and fall under a thin sheet of plastic and hope. And when the baby finally lived, when the numbers on the monitor stopped screaming, Jhon broke down in a hospital bathroom, crying so hard his scrubs were soaked. Do you know what he said? He said he'd seen more babies die than live, that he'd begun to wonder if all his effort was just an illusion, a fight against something bigger than himself. But that night, he wrote, "It all feels worth it." Oh, child, I know that feeling. The unbearable weight of hope. It's the same ache every mother feels when she waits for a heartbeat on a monitor, or a ring at the door, or a miracle she no longer dares to ask for. I once told a story like this before, about a woman named Lillian, remember? She prayed for her son through storms and silence until the day he returned in uniform, just to tell her he'd survived. If you haven't heard that one yet, go back and listen. It will help you understand what I mean when I say, hope isn't light, it's heavy, heavier than grief, because it asks you to keep carrying it when you have nothing left in your hands. And tonight, Jhon carried it. A doctor who hadn't slept in days, a stranger holding life between trembling fingers. And when that tiny heart kept beating, he realized that miracles don't roar, they whisper. That's what this story is about, my dear ones. Not about death or medicine or miracles, but about the kind of strength that hides behind tears, the kind you only find when your hope breaks but doesn't fall apart. Now sit with me. Let's open the next page together. Let me tell you about Jhon, the boy who found faith inside a hospital bathroom at 3 a.m. with a discharge note in one hand and his soul trembling in the other. Do you know what the world sounds like inside a hospital at night? It hums, not with life, but with the ache of it. The machines breathing for those who can't, the quiet shuffle of shoes carrying news no one wants to deliver. That's where Jhon lived most of his days, between the sound of monitors and the smell of antiseptic. He wasn't one of those loud, confident doctors you see on TV. No, he was quiet, careful, always the last to leave the ward, as if his footsteps might disturb the tiny lives hanging by a thread. He had just finished another 30-hour shift when they brought the baby in. A newborn, not even 2 days old, born with a heart that hadn't been shaped quite right. The kind of defect you can't fix with a single surgery, or even 2. It takes time, wait, hope. And time was the one thing that little heart didn't have. The mother was still sedated. The father stood in the hallway like a ghost, one hand over his mouth, the other clinging to the edge of the doorframe. He didn't say a word, but when Jhon looked at him, he saw it. The fear, the pleading, the silent deal every parent makes with the universe. Take anything, anyone, just not my child. So Jhon took the case, his first real one. He didn't feel ready. He wasn't ready. But no one ever is, not when a life fits in your palm. He wrote in his notes that night, infant male, cyanotic, Critical. Simple words that couldn't begin to describe what he was seeing. A body fighting to stay here. The first surgery went long. The baby's heart was swollen, the tissue thin and trembling. Every movement had to be exact, not too deep, not too slow. Jhon's attending stood over him, guiding, watching. And when they finished, the baby's heart still beat, weak but steady. They couldn't close the chest that night, too much swelling, too much risk. So they left it open, covered, hoping time would do what their hands could not. For days, Jhon didn't leave that room. He took naps in a chair, drank coffee that tasted like metal, whispered prayers between rounds. He called the baby Little Soldier because every hour that heart fought like one. He'd check the numbers, whisper to the nurses, adjust the tubes, check again, and every morning before rounds began, he'd just stand there, looking at the monitor, trying to convince himself that one steady line of green could mean more than all the red ones that came before. One evening, the attending told him to go home. He didn't. He couldn't. Because he'd learned something dangerous. When you care too much, leaving feels like betrayal. Days turned to weeks. They tried closing the chest once, but the baby's numbers plummeted. They had to stop. So, Jhon waited again. Waited through alarms, through crying, through silence. Until one morning, when the night nurse whispered, "He's stable." For the first time in weeks, Jhon saw the numbers hold steady, white against black. No chaos, no dips, just steady. He didn't smile, not yet. He'd lost too many before to celebrate too soon. But something inside him shifted, like a single candle flickering on after endless dark. 3 days later, the swelling eased. They closed the chest. It was delicate, slow, every suture a silent prayer. And when the final one was tied, Jhon looked up and saw his attending's eyes glisten. Neither of them spoke. After that, the days felt lighter. They still ran tests, still worried, still watched every breath. But the baby kept healing. Every result came back clear. Every morning brought a little more color to his cheeks. And then came the day of discharge. Jhon had stayed up the night before, checking charts that didn't need checking. When he finally sat down to write the discharge note, patient stable, no complications, follow up in 2 weeks, he couldn't stop shaking. He finished typing, signed his name, and then disappeared into the staff bathroom. That's where he cried. Hard. The kind of crying that doesn't make sound, it just takes over. Because in that moment, every failure, every body he'd coded, every child he'd lost came back. And this one, this tiny one, had made it. He cried because it wasn't just the baby who had survived. It was him. The boy who had once cursed his mentor for showing him too much, for making him feel too much. He finally understood that to heal another is to risk being broken yourself, and that sometimes the only thing keeping you standing is the unbearable weight of hope you refuse to put down.
You know, there's something I've learned about people like Jhon. They don't break the way most of us do. No, they bend quietly, invisibly, like branches heavy with too much rain. And one day, the world wonders why they finally snap. But they don't see all the nights they spent holding others together while falling apart themselves. That's the thing about healers. They carry everyone else's pain and call it purpose. They tell you they're fine, even when they've forgotten what fine feels like. Jhon wrote that he'd lost count of how many babies he'd seen die. He said he started feeling like death followed him, like his hands weren't meant to save, only to witness endings. He even confessed that sometimes, after every code blue, he'd stay behind in the empty room, just holding the tiny blanket, not to mourn the baby, but to remind himself that he tried, that trying still meant something. I know that feeling too. You see, I once loved someone like Jhon, a nurse. She was my sister, Evelyn. She used to say, "Clara, healing people is easy. It's living after they're gone that's hard." And oh, she was right. She'd come home with her scrubs still smelling of bleach and sorrow. She'd make tea, sit by the fire, and fall silent. And I'd know someone didn't make it that day. She'd never say their name. She just went quiet. Because hope hurts. And when you hold too much of it, it begins to burn. I think that's what Jhon felt, sitting in that bathroom at 3 a.m. He wasn't crying because of relief. He was crying because he'd carried hope for too long, too hard, too alone. And it had finally broken open inside him. There's a strange truth about people like him, about all of us who dare to love the fragile, the fleeting. We don't cry when things go wrong. We cry when they finally go right, because the body doesn't know how to hold both joy and grief in the same breath. And sometimes those tears are the only language the soul has left. I wonder how many of you listening tonight are carrying your own unbearable weight of hope. Maybe it's not a child on a hospital bed. Maybe it's a marriage you keep believing can heal. Maybe it's someone you've been waiting for to come home, to say sorry, to see you. Maybe it's yourself, the version of you that you keep praying will come back. If that's you, I want you to hear me, my dear. Hope is not weakness. It's proof that your heart is still alive. But you must remember, even light needs rest. Even candles must go out for a while. So tonight, before you sleep, do what Jhon did. Lay it down, all of it, the guilt, the waiting, the maybe someday, and whisper, "Thank you." Not because it's over, but because you're still here to keep hoping. That's what Jhon taught me, not through words, but through the trembling of his story. That hope isn't about winning. It's about surviving long enough to see why it mattered. You know, I sat here for hours after reading Jhon's story. The candle on my desk had burned down to nothing. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you listen to your own heartbeat. And I thought about that boy, how he'd spent years learning to open chests, to hold hearts in his hands. But no one had ever taught him how to hold his own. He'd written at the end of his post, "I know it's just half the battle done, but the strength this gives me feels surreal." And when I read that word, surreal, something inside me broke open. Because that's what hope feels like after you've suffered too long. Unreal, unbelievable, as if your body doesn't know how to carry joy without fearing it might vanish again. I think that's what makes his story sacred. Not because he saved a life, but because he remembered why it matters to try. You see, we live in a world that celebrates the big victories, the medals, the news stories, the miracles caught on camera. But the real courage happens quietly. At 3 a.m. in hospital bathrooms, in living rooms where mothers pray over silent phones, in hearts that keep beating after being broken 100 times over. That's where faith lives, not in the shouting, but in the staying. And when Jhon sat there crying after that baby lived, that was faith being reborn. He thought he was alone, falling apart, but that's the moment God often chooses to slip closest. Not when you win, but when you finally stop pretending you have to. Maybe that you needed to hear that tonight, that your tears don't mean you're weak, that the exhaustion you carry is sacred, proof of your love, not the absence of it. That even when you doubt the worth of your work, your words, your waiting, something beautiful is still being written through you. Hope, my dear ones, isn't light. It's a weight you learn to carry differently. You stop fighting it and start letting it teach you. Because the heart doesn't grow strong by avoiding pain, it grows strong by surviving it. So if tonight you find yourself weeping or praying for something you can't fix, think of Jhon. Think of that baby, tiny chest stitched shut, heart still beating. Think of how you whispered thank you into the silence, even when nothing felt certain. That's what I want you to remember. That miracles are not loud. They are the softest, smallest, most trembling kind of courage. And you, yes, you, are part of that miracle every time you choose to hope again.
You know, every time I close one of these stories, I sit for a while. I trace the rim of my teacup, listen to the clock tick, and I think about how many people I'll never meet. People like Jhon, whose names are buried under layers of duty and silence. People who save lives without ever realizing they're saving their own. That's the thing about stories like his. They don't end when the monitor beeps steady. They echo in every person who's ever prayed for one more day, one more chance, one more heartbeat. And I think about that baby sometimes. He'd be growing now, laughing somewhere, with no idea that a stranger once sat weeping in a bathroom because he lived. That's how love works when it's pure. It gives and never asks to be remembered. Jhon will go on to see more heartbreak, more miracles, more nights that blur into morning. But he'll carry that first heartbeat with him forever. Because the first life you help save, it never leaves you. It becomes the pulse that steadies your own. And I suppose that's true for all of us. Every soul we touch leaves a rhythm inside us, sometimes faint, sometimes fierce, but always there, a quiet between our own heartbeats, reminding us we mattered. That's all for tonight, my loves. If this story found you in a heavy place, let it rest with you, not on you. And if you've been carrying too much, the waiting, the worry, the hope, just remember Jhon's words. I finally helped a child make it through. And that's all any of us are really trying to do, isn't it? Help something make it through, whether it's a person, a dream, or a part of ourselves we thought had stopped breathing. Now, before we close the book, I'll leave you with this. Next week, I'll tell you about a woman who waited 20 years for an apology that never came, and how she learned to forgive someone who wasn't sorry. But that's a story for another night. Sleep well, my dear ones. Keep your hearts open and your hope gentle.